I'm just walking on a main street in Keith, and so far I've passed a Smitty Lane, a Plew Lane, Sodgers Lane, Fermers Lane. They've actually got street signs up here in Doric. Now, why do I find that so surprising?
I speak Doric at school, at home, proud to be Scottish and proud to speak the way I do.
You know, if I go to the Western Isles, everything there's in Gaelic and English. Actually, if I go to home base in Inverurie, they've got directions up there in Gaelic and signs up in Gaelic. And frankly, Gaelic hasn't been spoken in this part of the world for a long, long time, whereas Doric has. Still is.
I will always speak Doric at home and with my friends, and it just comes out naturally in speech because I've been around it for so long. A bit like they or Swedian. It's very unique.
I'm Mark Stephen. Welcome to Our Story. In this series, I'm going to be taking a close look at life in the northeast of Scotland and delving into our past to find out what made us who we are today.
We were brought up with the Doric, and you didn't think of it as anything special. It was just, that was just the way things were. That was the way that you spoke.
Doric is one of the clearest indications that you are in the northeast of Scotland. It is undergoing something, I would say, of a modest revival, which is why I'm here in Keith. I'm here to meet local councillor Stuart Cree, who was involved in the renaming of some of Keith's many, many lanes.
Keith is a town that was designed and laid out in the 18th century, and it was laid out on a fixed model with 3 parallel streets and connecting lanes, a large number, over 100 lanes if you count each section individually. And over the generations, these lanes acquired names that reflected particularly the shops at the end of each lane. So you would have had in the past Hepworth lanes when the shop that we're just coming up to now used to be a Hepworth store. The difficulty with that is quite obvious, because now with the generations we have, they don't remember where Hepworth was. So the first job we were handed was a request to get some names for the lanes. And during that time we came across some words that we felt better reflected aspects of Keith in Doric. So instead of having Farmers Lane, there are very few farmers in Keith, there are farmers. So we've got Farmers Lane, and instead of having Soldiers Lane, we've got Sodgers Lane, which is a Doric term for that.
What was the reaction when you said to folk that we want to put some of these in Doric?
I think there's a recognition now that Doric in a native tongue is far more acceptable.
Do you do council business in Doric?
No, we don't, but I use Doric terms frequently, and I also blog in Doric. When I go to community councils, the community council conducts its business in Doric. They use a sanitised form of Doric sometimes, but as discussion gets more earnest and heated, then Doric becomes more prominent. It is their language. It's a language we relax into rather than pretend to have.
I did get a bit of a yark when I went to the girls' high school. They would have crucified you if you spoke Scots. So I'd be very posh when I went to school, and at home I could just like slip it on your slippers and just be nice and comfy and speaking Scots at home.
When people went elsewhere, they spoke in a more anglified way because they felt ashamed, and that had been bred into them. They felt a wee bit ashamed because by speaking in Doric, it inferred that you came from some part of society that was less deserving or less cultured. I think you just throw off the shackle and say, no, I grew up speaking like this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with speaking in Doric.
Councillor Stuart Cree, and we'll be coming back to Keith later in the programme. I mean, Doric's certainly been promoted here, but folk living in the northeast weren't always encouraged to speak it. In fact, in the last century, schools actively discouraged Doric speaking, and it became very much confined to the home or indeed the playground.
When I was a kid at school, it was very much frowned upon by the educationalists of the time. In fact, I'd go as far as say if you said something it was in Doric, you could end up getting a strap for it.
Well, it started in the 18th century. It became fashionable to use English instead of Scots, and the idea was that to get on, to further yourself, you had to speak what was thought of as proper English, correct English, and not only Doric but all the different forms of Scots were actively discouraged in the schools, and they were looked down on and seen as slovenly speech, which they're not, of course.
Derek McClure is the author of Doric, the Dialect of the North-East, and he explains how schools went about persuading pupils to speak proper.
Teachers saw it as part of their remit to persuade the children or force the children to use English, what was called proper English. And every time this is discussed in public, people remember, somebody stands up and remembers getting belted for saying I'm a bohème or something of the kind. But fortunately we've outgrown that attitude now.
My mother's generation got belted, as far as I understand. Mine got ridiculed and shamed and humiliated. There was one wee loon in my class that I don't think he could have spoken English if he'd been paid. And the teacher made his life such a misery that when me and a family come along, I taught them how to speak English.
But Doric was to enter the wider public consciousness in the 70s, something which gave native speakers in this area a real cultural boost. In 1969, after an appearance at the Edinburgh Festival, the comedy Scotland the What was a massive success. Derek McClure explains the appeal.
Scotland the What makes a great appeal because their sketches were very funny, very clever, very entertaining, and they touched a chord. People who had spoken Doric in their childhood, or people who came from farming stock or came from rural stock where Doric was still the native speech, it reminded them of the past, and their material was really so clever and so funny. Once, even for people whose native language wasn't Doric, even for people who at first found the Doric kind of hard to understand, because they were appreciated elsewhere in Scotland. In other parts of Scotland where the local speech was very different from North-Eastren Doric, once the audiences there got used to the Doric, they roared with laughter at the sketches because they were so funny in themselves.
Sit you down, Mr. Christie.
Thank you, sir.
Nice to see you.
To see you, nice.
Well now, you've come in to make your will.
Aye.
Well, that's very sensible.
Got him there, look at his bodies, hasn't it?
Buff Hardy was one of the writers of Scotland the What.
We always regarded Doric as being the language of the agricultural hinterland, as opposed to the city accent, which is certainly a northeast accent, but it's much harsher, kind of doon the tune.
Interesting you should say that, though, because there is a very clear distinction between agricultural Doric, rural Doric, say somewhere like Turriff, and then you go to the Broch, or Fitty, and it's a different,
completely different.
Well, it's a staccato. On the coast, it's faster, it's more staccato, it's harder. Whereas there's this lovely, it's a bit like the countryside. It kind of rolls out in the countryside.
You see, Steve, we would both be what the agricultural people would call tunes dirt. We were both tunesers. We both were born in Aberdeen and brought up, went to school in Aberdeen. But during the war, Steve was evacuated to Turfens, and the Doric that he produces in our show, I think, is Turfens Doric, and this bears out what you say. It's a much softer, and you can almost hear the low and the nout. And whereas if you go to the Broch or Macduff or Cairnbulg is a place which is completely different, and it's much harder. And as someone once, you can hear the whine of the wind in the rafters of the mission hall.
Coming from the Broch, and I was actually from one of the small villages just outside the Broch, Cairnbulg, there are an abundance of words that are completely different. For example, instead of saying snow or sna, we would say snyav, or a scurry for a seagull, or sometimes they get called a meav. A dog's a dog. My grandfather was my daddy.
But I think this is the thing about the North-East dialect, that, well, from village to village it changes. But the character in the will is very much an Aberdeenshire farmer that Steve had as a client.
Well, but what about your heritable property?
My hybrid.
Your heritable property. Now, you own your own farm.
Aye. Sharm the dogs abog helica boorty bray. Means.
I think the musicality of the Doric, it must have helped. That they found it an enjoyable dialect to listen to, and of course it had to be comprehensible, and it seems that it was. I mean, you got a kind of reaction, largely from people in Glasgow, who just wouldn't go near the theatre when it was on or listen to it, because, I never understand that. Who could understand that? And but the fact is, many of their fellow Glaswegians did and enjoyed it. But as Steve used to say, there's nothing so parochial as a big city. And Glasgow is the centre of the universe, and there still is an element of central belt scepticism about the North-East, I think, isn't there?
Given how cosmopolitan Aberdeen as a city is, how oil and gas orientated, etc., there are folk from all around the world here, and yet you say you're from Aberdeen, folk have an idea. And is Scotland the what to blame for that?
I don't think so. We had a string of sketches we called Doric and Feed, and the Doric character was the funny one, and the Feed was usually someone from the professional classes in Aberdeen, like the lawyer and the old farmer. There's a sketch, Mastermind, where we did an After Tara, Petty Crime and After Tara, May to June 1981. That was his specialist subject, and he got the better of Magnus Magnusson. The Doric character always won when there was an interaction with the city.
And although the police never caught the knicker thief, were there any suspects?
Oh, there were no suspects. Aberdeen, the village Kent, it was the bunker.
Correct.
Nobody except the Bobby, because he was a new Bobby, because the old Bobby had got a shift. Why, the old Bobby kid was the bunker, because he was an accomplice, that's why he got a shift.
There's a definite dryness to North-East humour, and it's wee things like, years ago when I was a student, I worked in the scaffy wagons, so if we worked hard, we'd be finished by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We then hid in the trees, and then about 3 o'clock, no one ever said, that's it, it's time to go back to the depot. It was all done with an in-breath. Somebody'd go, that was it, and everybody packed up their piece bags and off it went, and it was like a siren going off. That doesn't exist anywhere else in Scotland.
We did a take-off of the Beech Grove Garden, in which Steve played George Barron, and in the course of that, he uses this, hi, and
that's it.
And it's an intake aspiration.
Well, George, your roses doing well?
Aye. Oh, aye.
Where did you get your roses from? Was it Anderson's?
No, Anderson's, aye.
The spoken language itself has umpteen variations within this corner of the North-East. But what of written Doric? How do you actually go about setting that down? Traditionally, it wasn't a language that was really written down, but two modern notable exceptions to that are BBC Radio Scotland's Take the Floor presenter and Doric columnist Robbie Shepherd, and author and journalist Norman Harper. And I'm joining them in the Broadstrike in Elric. Between the pair of you produce a tremendous body of work. How do you go about setting it down? I'm just trying to think of, when, fan. How do you write that down?
There are two versions, you see. There's fan, meaning when as a question, and fin, meaning when as a statement in time. How's that?
I'm getting my brain's hurting already, Shepherd.
Well, can I give you a great example? A red hood. I've just seen a fine red hood because I got fire red up in the hood. It's two different things, Norman, isn't it?
It is. A red up's a mess, and two red up is to tidy up a mess.
Correct. Now there you are.
First time I went to Norway, I couldn't believe how many comparable words there were. I mean, a builder in Norway is a bigger. We talk about bigging stuff up around it.
Well, I find it extremely funny that the Norwegian word for a hoover is a stoorsugar.
Aberdeen was a major trading city all through the Middle Ages and later, still is, but it had more contact with the Hanseatic League, with the towns of North Germany and with Scandinavia than it had with the rest of Scotland. And there are Scandinavian words, there are Dutch words in Doric as in other forms of Scots. One of the things that has made Scots distinctive is its borrowings from other languages. These are things that have given the Doric and given all forms of Scots its distinctive ring.
You've got Kirk, you've got Bern, you've got Sark,
Kent.
It's exactly the same in the music with the whaling, with the number of tunes that went back and forth. Cape Breton with the music as well. So obviously the words travelled, but they didn't travel very far when you come to the northeast of Scotland, because you go within 5 miles and you get, say, Cairnbog, and then go inland just that wee bit. It's different words altogether, and you spoke about write them down. Well, I think Norm and I write them down as we knew them.
I actually knew an old gentleman when I was growing up in Afford who could listen to you for 2 minutes and tell you within 5 miles where on the Don you'd been brought up. That's how distinctive the language is. It really focuses down really tightly, and that's why it's difficult to write to suit everybody.
Those regional variations also posed a really big challenge for Gordon Hay, who spent 6 years of his life translating the New Testament into Doric.
I was brought up in the parish of Inverkeithny, to the west of Turriff, and I therefore tried as far as possible to stick to the Doric used in that area. Before I published it, I was being asked by several ministers and church members for excerpts to use at services, and I'm aware that since publication it has been fairly widely used, including an invitation to myself to do a reading for the royal family at Crathy Kirk last year.
A while after a lad stunning about says to Steenie, "Surely you're een of them, you man be, you for Galilee." He left a mouth a cursing and swearing, saying, "I dinna ken it, Sheila va." We at the cock crew eens meer, and Steenie mind on for Jesus at Sedlum. Afore a cock craws twice, you'll disown me 3 times. And he roared and grat.
I think I was probably the first of the modern generation that was introduced to Doric through the educational system. I know my father, his generation, it was very much frowned upon. He has a great story. North-East farmer never spoke anything other than Doric, and he used to say that he had an ideal system for dealing with callers on the phone trying to sell him kitchens or double glazing. He just said, "Nah, laddie, I dinna ken what you're saying, I just speak Doric," and they immediately hung up on him.
When I started writing, one of the words I had was funerd. And I said to my dad, "I need to get the English word for that." And he said, "Well, trackled." And I said, "No, I don't think so, Dad. It was a funerd, trackled, we read for fochen." And we get up and went out and bought an English Scots dictionary, because he didn't ken. He really did not ken the English.
Sheena Blackhall was appointed the Macker Poet Laureate for Aberdeen in 2009. Sheena is a traditional ballad singer, a songwriter, writer, illustrator, storyteller, talented lady. She works with schools to promote the use of the Doric language. We popped in to one of her sessions with primary 2s at Kingsford School in Aberdeen.
Are we ready? Actions and everything? 3 cross sat upon a wa, sat upon a wa. That's part of the reading bus outreach. On the bus, they have puppets, they have storytelling, they have singing. When I'm working in a school like this, I'll let them hear different storytellers. I'll bring in, because it's good for them to hear somebody else speaking. I'll take in examples of Ewan McVicar, who's an excellent Scots storyteller, super. The late Stanley Robertson. Also, I'll go online and let them see movies that they've made, little animations that children have made in Scots. First Crow was waiting for his ma on a cold and frosty morning. Second, I can see that Doric will continue to consolidate the good work that's currently being done in it, and that more and more materials will be produced. I would like to see it going down the Gaelic route, where it receives more funding, obviously, and more interest. That's something that teachers often ask. They ask for more resources, but they want to hear the spoken resources. Often they would be happier for specialists coming in who can speak it with the bairns, or bring in materials that they can use, or give them materials that they can use. Now, have a listen. Do you use some of these words? Which word do you use at all? Puddick. Puddick, oh, I like a puddick. Yes. Quine is a lovely, isn't it? Oh. Beautiful, a quine.
Your walksters, lugs, your fingers.
Give yourselves a clap for answering so well.
You see, the passion for Doric is really clear there. For some, the symbolism of using their mother tongue for key moments in their life is just too important to miss. When Colin Wilson and Fiona Henderson decided to get married back in 2008, they chose to say I div rather than I do, and set about arranging to have the whole wedding ceremony conducted in Doric.
Now, I'll call on this look here about this.
To give witness
That
I, Lindsay Colin Wilson, take you, Fiona James Henderson.
We couldn't have a word in Aberdeen. That was a decision for the chief registrar of the day. And in the letter I got for him, it said this. I'll read it out. Registrars are not compelled to conduct ceremonies if they feel that unusual requests would detract from the solemnity of the occasion. He carried on to compare hen a wedding ceremony in the Doric to being like hen a wedding dressed up as pixies or Disney characters. I wrote to the Chief Registrar of Scotland and I got a helpful letter back from him saying that if it happened, shouldn't have happened, and he said that marriage law in Scotland allows for a marriage to ging ahead in any language as long as the important folk, the registrar, the couple, the witnesses and that understand what's being said.
We ended up being able to hear the ceremony in Newborough, and that was done by one of the registrars for Ellen, which is in Aberdeenshire. So it all ended fine in that respect. As I sail to my vow, I'll wear this ring. It'll be a sign of our marriage.
It is the tongue that Fiona and me speak with one another all the time, and especially when we hear something important we want to say to one another. And seeing as the wedding ceremony we were going to hear would be some of the most important things we were ever going to say to one another, it would make sense that we would hear it in our own tongue.
Everybody thought that it was rare, especially my dad. My dad was just delighted the fact that he could speak normal rather than putting on the pan loaf, I think he said in his speech, something along that lines. Made us proud as well that we'd been able to do something like that, Ken. It'll give me rare pleasure to declare that Colin and Fiona are man and wife, and fitter would gain the bride a courtship.
Colin Wilson and Fiona Henderson there, whose wedding service was in Doric at long last. I'm back here in Keith, where Doric is not just cheerfully adopted, it's seen as a business opportunity. I've come along to Mid Street, one of the main shopping streets in Keith, and I'm just going to Mither Tongue. And this is a Doric shop owned by Marguerite or Maggie Cruikshank.
Words in the Windies kind of stemmed from an earlier project that we had gone, but we called it Rabbie's Rhymes. It was in we tried to make the poem relevant to the business. For example, you kind of would have had the Gowden Locks of Anna and the hairdresser's Windy and stuff like that. You can. Instead of Rabbie's Rhymes now we've got words in about 20 odd, maybe nearer 30 Windies.
What words are you actually using?
We've got Sark, I think, in the Draper's Windy. We've got Bubbly Jock in the Butchers.
It's interesting, this part of the world, because the concept of onomatopoeia, a word sounding like what it is. I mean, the word coke, it's what you do.
That's right, and it sounds exactly like what it is. There was something that really disgusted me on Facebook, and I was so angry about it, I just put the one word, coke. But it's very expressive.
Are we talking a language, or are we talking a dialect?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's its own language. There's certain words that you would never use. It's more than a dialect, and it's got to be preserved.
I think it's the dialect of Scots that we speak in the North-East, but, as Robbie says, with some very, very distinctive words that lift it above a dialect, but not quite to the stretch of a language. And I think it's something that too many people don't realise or appreciate or are proud of.
I dispute that a wee bit, Norman, because a lot of the kids are being encouraged encouraged to use Doric or to understand their own tongue.
I usually tell the story of the school bus. When I was going to school at Inverurie Academy, everybody spoke Doric on the bus. About 2 years ago, I had to take a trip on the bus, and I was listening to the pupils as they boarded the bus and chatted. Not a single word of Doric. Now, 40 years ago, pure Doric. Today, it's global English. It's global culture English. And that's what worries me a wee bit.
No, I don't speak Doric at all. I kind of moved away from it when I was at school. I think that's the problem because there's more people coming from different areas and different countries. I think the young people nowadays lose the Doric accent, and as you can hear from my accent, I definitely don't have a Doric accent.
Well, there's one young person right there who isn't speaking Doric. But according to Derek McClure, youngsters in Aberdeen City are forming a new Doric derivative all of their own.
I think a distinctive city speech is beginning to emerge among young people. They certainly don't speak traditional Doric, but what they're speaking should not be despised. It's a new Aberdeen city dialect.
Well, some of the words and expressions that I use sometimes are like, I write ged, which is like hello person, and like gaj. Gaj is like a boy and gaji is a girl. Cov's like, I write cov, it's just the same as gaj. If I was going out, me and my friends would usually say, are you coming out for a peeve? It just means going out and like hanging. One of my friends stay in like Woodside area, and they speak a lot more common in Doric than I do, and I think I speak quite differently from people from Tory.
We've got our little lingo. Ken, even Tory from Marsick, we speak different, you know what I mean? And then everybody's kind of taken bits from everywhere and just kind of got their own thing going. Like some of the words we would use is gaji, gal, dam, on the lash. Mum and Dad wouldn't say on the lash, they say going out in the tune or something like that. Sounds nice.
And for those with Doric roots, cyberspace maintains a connection with the language. There's a Doric Facebook page with a huge following. And if you're on Twitter, the Doric Dictionary can send you a Doric word ilka day.
One of my favourite phrases in Doric comes from Charles Murray's poem Winter. He says, butter skites and winna spread.
Holly rackets are there. By the ends.
Compluthery or Boerige.
Yoke. Yoke oogsters. There's Yeoman oogsters and Balfin oogsters and Assorts.
You've been listening to Our Story on BBC Radio Scotland. I'm Mark Stephen. If you'd like more information about the programme, then please go to our website at bbc.co.uk/Radio Scotland and just click on Our Story. Until the next time, thanks for listening.
And a nice one that's come up is statutories for patios. Statutories, you must have a statutory. Nothing without a statutory. Yes.
Begake, also stamagasta. I use begake. It could be a surprise, you know. It could be a pleasant surprise.
It's a pleasant stamagasta.
It's a pleasant stamagasta.
Yes, there you go. Begake.
Begake, that's it.
92 to 95 FM, 810 medium wave, and on digital radio. BBC